For this podcast, I want to talk a little bit about wheat and weeds. When we're looking at the parables of Jesus, we have to ask ourselves, why did Jesus talk in parables? And what I really believe is Jesus talked in parables to help people see the message that he had for them, or the critical messages that they needed. We've got to remember that back in that time, they didn't have television, they didn't have movies. I'm not even sure they had theater in Jesus's area where you could go down and see a play. I'm thinking that might have been more of a Roman and Greek thing, so that might not have been completely foreign to them, but I don't see them as doing that. So there was a lot of families sitting around in candlelight, with light, with not electrical lamps, but lamps with oil, and telling stories. That's the way all ancient people lived. So we have to assume that in Jesus's day, that's how they uh, enjoyed time together, entertained each other, uh, got each other's brains to go, was in the sharing of stories. And so Jesus told these stories, or these parables, that were filled with metaphor. Now, I'm a person who really, really connects to metaphor, and I can understand that from reading the Bible, that probably it confused a lot of people when Jesus was speaking, but he was trying to give them a story within within they can actually engage and think and begin to see themselves. Now, you would think that today people studying these parables, especially people that are educated, in some cases highly educated, the sophistication of looking at metaphors should be something okay for them to do. And that was the case. I've been participating in a men's Bible study on Wednesday nights during this Lent season, which is looking at a variety of things. And one of the things that we have looked at recently is looking at a few of the parables of Jesus. I think next Wednesday there are some more. We started out looking at the Sermon on the Mount and things like that. And I do need to give props to the young man, the young preacher who is leading the study, because he's doing a really, really, really fine job. We looked at several parables at our last session, and one of them was looking at the parable of the weeds and the wheat, and where it talks about these are my computer glasses. I don't see a pair of reading glasses here. Okay, I've got to get a pair of reading glasses. Well, electric green wasn't my first choice, but this is what it's going to be. So I'm reading from Matthew chapter 13, verses 24 through 30. He put before them another parable. The kingdom of heaven may be compared to someone who sowed good seed in his field. But while everybody was asleep, an enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and then went away. So when the plants came up and bore grain, then the weeds appeared as well. And the slaves of the household came and said to him, Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? Where then did these weeds come from? He answered, An enemy has done this. The slave said to him, Then do you want us to go and gather them? But he replied, No, for in gathering the weeds, you would uproot the wheat along with them. Let both of them grow together until the harvest, and at harvest time, I will tell the reapers, Collect the weeds first and bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn. And between this and, the parable of the sower, and I think we were supposed to look at some of the other parables during our class, but we didn't actually get into those. We kind of got bogged down in this whole idea of wheat and weeds. I started out talking about, the people in Jesus' day, many of them could not read and write, and they would not have been, I don't want to say they would not have been intelligent, because they certainly could have been intelligent. They may not have been educated, but even uneducated people should be able to think. In this Wednesday night study that I've been participating, I would guess there's 12 to 15 men that are in this group. There are a couple men that are in their 30s or 40s. Probably most of them are in their 60s and 70s. I would judge by their appearance that probably most of them, maybe all of them, are educated, probably highly educated. They certainly look very polished and very professional. Certainly people that should be able to understand metaphor and engage in a conversation. Well, anyway, the young pastor who's leading this group has tried within this study to bring us focused on relationships with other people. And I'm inferring relationships with people in the church, relationships with people in our world, and including them into our churches. And he continued to draw that point into this. And I was surprised when someone in the group and the man sitting next to them got kind of excited about the weeds being gathered and burned. They were laughing and giddy. And one of them even said, with his humongous Bible and his reading glasses on his nose and his perfectly combed hair, said, because they're saying, well, what do you think this particular parable is about? And he proudly said, it's about judgment. They're going to get theirs. And I don't normally go to this Bible study. I've gone to some of the men's events, but this is the first time I've gone to the men's Bible study. Well, for one thing, I actually have 4 things to do every Wednesday, and so I have to choose which one of those 4. 2 of them are in-person studies at churches, and 1 is an online thing. So I thought, I really want to, I really don't like online things, so I really wanted to try this. And I know it's very easy for me to be outspoken. So it's very easy for me to not pay attention to how much I speak in a group. And so I tried really, really hard not to say much. But I could tell that the young pastor leading this group was trying to say, yes, Jesus doesn't ignore the fact that there is right and wrong. And Jesus does not downplay judgment. But what he tried to tell the people is, that's not your job. That's not your lane. You're not here to judge people. That's God's job. Your job is to grow and minister to people together. Let God sort them out later. And so our young preacher leader, who's an excellent preacher, by the way, um, he's very soft spoken, but he kept drawing the point back to, well, yes, judgment is there. But if you notice in this series of parables, Jesus is sharing parables, and it's about how you treat people and how you're together with people. And it says, you don't pull up the weeds and cast them to the side, because when you do that, you're going to pull up some wheat. And so I thought, this man and the man sitting next to you that are giddy with joy because these people are going to be burned, and only saw judgment in this. And how many verses did we have here in this, just this paragraph? It's 6 verses, and it's only in the last half of the 6th verse where it's talking about the weeds being collected and burned. And I was reminded of, the story of Jonah. Jonah, and when he finally consents and goes to Nineveh and preaches to the people, and the people put on sackcloth and repent. Uh, Later on in the Bible, we find out that their repentance didn't stick. But Jonah then sets up him a little booth under a fig tree to watch for God to come kill all these people. And lo and behold, that's what I saw. And I didn't really, and I had said something earlier in the evening, and so I thought, well, if I speak once, that's good. But I felt like I had to say something, and so um, the pastor had already tried to redirect and says, yes, but notice Jesus is sharing with these people that they're off focus, and they need to be focused on relationships with people and loving others and loving your neighbors and loving your enemies and all this. And then he does acknowledge, he pops in and kind of says what he needs to say. Don't worry, that's not your job, but God will take care of that. And then he gets right back into the next uh, 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 parables after that in this series of parables that are on focus. But even with all of our intellect and all of our resources we have available to us tonight, I was stunned to see the joy and giddiness that these two men had, saying, this is all about judgment. This is all about them bad people getting what. And it just so clearly is not. It just so clearly is not. So what I said was, well, what I really see in here is this is more a direction for us in ministry and how we're supposed to minister to everybody and everybody together. And I was further stunned with the man who had been doing all the talking while the other man was laughing and cheering him on. He said, what for? The weed can never be wheat. And I tried to be quiet, but my face speaks 1,000 words, I'm sure, because I'm just like, and I was stunned. It was even worse that this particular evening, I brought a retired friend of mine who is struggling to have enough engagement with people. So he was my guest visiting with me that evening. And he didn't leave it right there. His next words. Now, I don't know exactly what he meant by this. I didn't ask him. Uh, since we had just a little back and forth here, in addition to what our preacher leader was giving, I kind of thought maybe he'd come up and talk to me. He did come up and talk to me the previous week to let me know that I was sitting in his chair. So, you know how many points that scored. And then he kind of laughed. He said, "Oh, you're changing in, sitting down in my area." Well, it's a long table. I've only been here 2 or 3 times. I sat there and I sat there, and tonight I made sure and sat in a different spot. But he did speak to me once. um, then the very next thing he said was, "And even if the wheat tells you, no, even if the weed tells you they're a wheat, that doesn't mean they are, just because they can say they're a wheat." And I don't know really what he meant by that. Um, I've made some assumptions and I've jumped to conclusions, which is probably wrong, but I did. And so, but while he said that, he gave up to us that he really knew we were not really talking about actual wheat and actual weeds. He knew we were talking about a metaphor because he already personified the weed as being capable of talking and saying, I'm not a weed, I'm wheat." So we know that he was sophisticated enough to know we're talking metaphorically and we're not talking about actual wheat and actual weeds. And so I sat there and I continued to be quiet. And the preacher leader continued to lead our discussion, talking about how we're called into relations and relational uh, relationships with others. And they couldn't get off the judgment. They were excited about the judgment. They couldn't get to this. And I thought, "Larry, don't say anything more." But already I'm thinking, I have to say something. I have to see some life and some thought and some love in these people for others, or I don't know that I can come back here. I mean, that's really the thoughts that's going through my head. And I'm thinking like, oh my goodness, and I brought a visitor tonight. So I said, "Well, here's my fear." And I'm sitting on the long table and he's down at the end. And I'm looking, says, "Well, here's my fear. My fear is we're going to appoint someone out in the parking lot of the church. And as people come in, we're going to put signs on their chest: wheat, weeds, wheat, weeds, wheat, weeds, and segregate these so that we're not even going to give the wheat and the weeds opportunity to grow together." Because we're not talking about real weeds and real wheat. So that's where I am with this. I've shared with y'all before that I feel strongly that I'm called to be visible in my world, but I know I shouldn't feel attacked in this moment. I don't really feel attacked for me. Well, maybe a little. But I feel attacked for so many people in our world that don't get to wear the label of wheat. And while that man is talking with this very pressed white dress shirt, big, huge leather-bound Bible, his perfectly combed hair, I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that I could never be wheat in his church. And there are lots of people in his church that can never be wheat because he defined wheat and he only. Now, do I know this man? No. Do I know exactly what he meant for sure? No. But I've seen enough. I've seen enough. Excellent, a very good friend of mine sent me a message after my last book came out. I've written 27 books, by the way. This was my 27th. And it came about after my vision had got to the point that I can't work on the computers long enough to do that. So I said, okay, there's no more books. And I started going through my files, and then I found, oh, that book was basically written. So I started spending a few days going through it. I says, I can't find anything that's not done. Well, I did discover that as going through, there were 2 chapters that had a title and some notes but weren't written. So I did have to write 2 chapters. And about half the chapters did not have discussion questions at the end. So I did actually finish that. Was that last year? I think it was last year. And put that out. And a friend of mine sent me a text and said, you've written so many good things, but I'm not sure it's going to make a difference. You should give up. And I thought, have you met me? I'm not giving up. But I feel like giving up now. Of all places to continue to encounter people that are unwilling to minister to people together and let God sort them out later, because it's important them to know you belong, you don't belong, you belong, you don't belong. When it comes down to it, even if the church has an inclusive theology, it doesn't take very many people that are not inclusive to ruin the ministry opportunities of a church. And at this chapter in my life, do I have to subject myself to that? The answer is no, I do not. I do not. You know, I shared a few years ago when I found myself church hunting yet again. And there have been big chunks of my adult life where I've actually belonged to 2 churches. That has always tended to work for me, especially when I was a professor at SFA in Nacogdoches. There were actually 3 churches in that town that I went to. I eventually narrowed it down to just one that I went to every week. But I used to go to 2 services every Sunday. For a big chunk of my time in the last 10 years, maybe more than that, I've gone to 2 churches pretty much every Sunday. But, you know, after the pandemic, you know, I decided to be more involved in my 2 churches of choice. But I also knew that this is it. Anything happens where either or both of my 2 churches become unsupportable for me, I'm not church shopping again. I don't want to go it alone, but I can. I can. You know, I used to not officially counsel, but counsel men in the Father's First group that used to meet at Bering United Methodist Church, and then met at Grace Lutheran, and then actually met at Resurrection for a short while, but we changed the name to Out later. And I used to share with them. Some people were so afraid of being alone. They were so desperate not to be single that they would jump too quickly. It's only date 1, meet, date 2, kiss, date 3, get a U-Haul. I mean, that's not smart. And so I would tell people over and over and over, it's better to be alone than be with the wrong person. And that really is my thing when I'm looking at my spiritual community of support. I don't want to do it alone, but I can. And it would be better to be alone than be with the wrong people. And I know it's very bad. I mean, if your church community has a membership of 12,000 people and 5 people go out of their way to make you feel included and loved, and 5 people to go out of their way to make you feel unwanted, and so that's 10 people. What's 12,000? Although 12,000 people don't show up to church every week, probably 1,200. So let's say 1,200. Let's say 1,000. It's easier. So let's say 1,000 people minus those 10, 990 people can't tell you're any different than a piece of furniture. Then what do you do? So that's where I'm at. Okay, this is supposed to be a podcast, but now it sounds like a personal therapy session. But here's what we do need to know. You cannot read the Bible looking for what you want to find and ignore the context. And in this case, the metaphor that Jesus is speaking in. You can't be so excited about the killing and the burning of the weeds that you miss the message from God. Kind of goes back to the Sermon on the Mount. You have heard, but I tell you. Okay? So you have heard the last half of verse 30. But you have not heard the rest of that parable? And to be excited because the weeds are going to be burned? Why wouldn't you be sad and say, oh, what did I not do? Because these aren't weeds, these are people. What did I not do in the ministry and fellowship of my church and community that these weeds did not meet their demise? Goes back to the first thing the man said. Well, how is this about ministry? A weed can never be a wheat. There's the fallacy, because we're not talking about weeds. Someone with issues and problems can be a wheat. And without that understanding, the church has no purpose. That's it. I'm done with with this one here today. So, weeds and wheat. That's probably going to be the title of this. I'm just doing content now because I've got these thoughts in my mind that I needed to share. And we'll see how they edit out for next week's podcast. But if you feel me, be sure to like, share, and subscribe to this podcast. Thanks for watching.